This morning, Martha should have been heading to the reading of her son's will with a broken heart. But when her car brakes were cut, she realized the person who held her hand and sobbed at the funeral was the same person who wanted her in the next casket. Hi everyone, I'm Casey. Today's story is not just about money or an inheritance. It is about a mother's late awakening. Martha lost her son, and she nearly lost her own life at the hands of the person she once loved and trusted most. Please join me as we listen to Martha's painful, yet incredibly resilient words on her journey to find justice for her son. The house in Connecticut was deathly quiet this morning, with only the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounding like a countdown to something I wasn't ready to face. I sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, my fingers white from gripping my black leather handbag so tightly. Today was the day I had to sit in a sterile lawyer's office and listen to the final wishes of my son, Roberto. My poor, sweet Roberto. Every time his face flashed in my mind, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to draw a single breath. I finally picked up my phone, my hand trembling as I dialed Helen's number. I just needed a bit of support, a familiar face. When she answered, I swallowed hard and asked if she could stop by to pick me up because I didn't feel steady enough to get behind the wheel. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end, followed by a sigh so loud and exhausted it made me flinch. Helen told me she was right in the middle of a therapy session, claiming the funeral had drained her of every ounce of energy. She told me to just take my SUV, insisting it was safe and that she would see me there. The line went dead, with a hollow click that felt like a sharp blade cutting into my heart. I sat there staring at the screen, wondering how she could be at a spa or a session, and the day her husband's will was being read. A bitter realization began to sink in. For 5 years, I was the one telling Roberto to spoil her, to be the one to apologize whenever they fought. I had championed Helen, trying to make up for the fact that she lost her parents young. And in doing so, I had completely overlooked how much Roberto was carrying on his own shoulders. I took a deep breath and headed out to the garage, moving like a ghost. But just as I reached for the door handle of the SUV, Bill, my neighbor and an old retired police officer, came sprinting across the driveway. His face was pale, almost gray. He grabbed my arm and told me not to get in the car. He explained that he had been out walking his dog late last night and saw someone crouching under my vehicle, someone whose silhouette looked exactly like Helen's. Bill knelt down on the cold concrete and shone a flashlight toward the front wheel. A dark, thick liquid was slowly dripping onto the floor. He looked up at me with eyes full of pity and told me the brake lines had been cut with a single clean slice. He warned me that if I had hit 70 miles per hour on the highway, I wouldn't have stood a chance. My ears began to ring, and a violent shiver took over my entire body. I collapsed onto the ground, right next to that puddle of black fluid. Helen, the daughter-in-law I had protected and loved more than my own flesh and blood, had just tried to kill me. Right then, my phone buzzed with a text from her. It said to drive carefully. Those 3 words weren't a gesture of care anymore. They were the most calculated, most evil curse I had ever heard. I stumbled back into the living room, my legs feeling like they didn't belong to me anymore, heavy and disconnected from my brain. Bill reached for his phone, his face set in a grim line as he started to call the police. But I reached out and caught his wrist. I told him I needed a moment of silence. I needed to look back at everything before I could even think about stepping into that lawyer's office. I sank into my old leather armchair, the one with the worn-out patches that Roberto always teased me about. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the digital photo frame on the side table, the very last birthday gift Roberto ever gave me. As the screen flickered to life and the pictures began to cycle through, Each one felt like a jagged piece of glass cutting into my soul. A photo of Roberto at his Stanford graduation popped up. He was smiling, but even then, his eyes were etched with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I remembered that day so clearly now, but for all the wrong reasons. Back then, I hadn't given him a single cent for his tuition. Instead, I had poured every penny of my $100,000 savings into helping Helen open a high-end fashion boutique in Greenwich. It was a vanity project that she managed to run into the ground in less than 6 months. I can still hear my own voice telling Roberto that he was talented and strong, that he could handle student loans on his own. I told him Helen was fragile and needed my support. Roberto didn't argue. He just gave me a small, quiet nod. At the time, I chose to see it as understanding, but looking at his face in that photo now, I realize how bitter that silence truly was. Then more memories came rushing back, hitting me like a tidal wave. For Roberto's 30th birthday, I actually forgot the date entirely because I was so consumed with planning a luxury anniversary trip to the Maldives for him and Helen. I had pressured Roberto into paying for the entire thing, telling him that Helen deserved only the very best life had to offer. When he hesitated about the cost, I threw cruel words at him, asking why he was being so stingy with his own wife. I told him he had millions and that Helen had given up her youth to be with him. I had no idea that his company was struggling at the time, or that he was working 18-hour days just to keep our world from falling apart. I was so blind. The most painful memory came when Roberto wanted to buy back our old family estate in Vermont. I had stood there and pressured him to put the title in Helen's name alone. I told him he was too busy and that letting Helen manage the property was a sign of respect. Roberto, being the loyal son he was, just kept his head down and signed the papers. Standing in my living room now, thinking about those cut brake lines in the garage, I finally understand that his silence wasn't agreement. It was the absolute heartbreak of a son, realizing his mother valued a stranger more than her own child. A slow, burning anger started to simmer in my chest, pushing aside the numbness. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong to use my love to feed Helen's bottomless greed. She wasn't fragile at all. She was a predator wearing a swan's mask. Enough, I whispered to the empty room, my voice sounding cracked but steady. I refuse to let Roberto's sacrifice be trampled on for another second. I have to make this right, even if it means standing up to the very person I spent years building up. After hearing Bill's harrowing warning about the car, I didn't rush to the phone to call the police. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't just from the fear of what might have happened on the highway. I felt a sudden, desperate need to be close to Roberto, to the version of him that didn't involve Helen's constant demands. I walked into his home office, a room I had rarely visited because I used to complain it was too cluttered and always smelled like stale coffee. I pushed the door open and took a long, shaky breath. The faint, clean scent of his sandalwood cologne still lingered in the air, a ghost of a presence that made my knees feel weak. It felt as though he were still there, sitting at his mahogany desk, quietly working 18-hour days like a human ATM to fund his wife's bottomless appetite for luxury. I sat in his chair and pulled open the heavy middle drawer. My heart nearly stopped when I saw a small, hand-carved wooden box tucked behind some old folders. I expected to find dry financial ledgers or tax documents, but instead, I found dozens of handwritten letters. They were thank you notes from an orphanage in New Hampshire. As I read through them, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. For over a decade, Roberto had been quietly sponsoring life-saving heart surgeries for more than 20 children, and he had never mentioned it to me once. I felt a wave of nausea as I remembered the time I scolded him for being stingy because he refused to buy Helen her 5th Birkin bag. He had told me then that he needed to use the money for something more important, and I had actually laughed at him, calling him a man who didn't know how to enjoy life. The more I looked, the more I realized I had never truly known my own son. Deep under a stack of papers, I found a plaque for Philanthropist of the Year, hidden away as if he were ashamed of his own goodness. My Roberto, the one I always described as too successful to need any help, had a heart so big it was almost overwhelming. Then, I saw a small orange prescription bottle, dated only 3 months before he passed. It was a high-dose painkiller for severe stomach ulcers caused by chronic stress. It hit me like a physical blow. He was in agony, working himself to death. And yet every time I called him, he would just say he was fine and suggest I take Helen shopping because she was feeling down. I lowered my head onto the desk, my tears blurring the ink on the letters he had cherished. I did something I should have done years ago. I reached for his old, worn-out navy sweater that was draped over the back of the chair and pulled it on. I wrapped my arms around myself, breathing in what was left of him. I whispered an apology into the empty room, telling him how blind I had been. I had looked at Roberto as a pillar of financial security, a son who was too strong to feel pain. But now, I saw a man who was profoundly lonely and incredibly brave. A man who sacrificed his own happiness to provide a fake smile for a biased mother and a greedy wife. Martha had to wait until she lost her son to realize she had missed out on a beautiful soul. Have we ever, in our faith in a loved one's strength, inadvertently overlooked their silent wounds? Martha is preparing to move on with a different mindset. Please leave a comment and share with Casey if you've ever regretted not listening to your loved ones deeply enough. I carefully folded Roberto's old navy sweater and placed it back on the center of his mahogany desk. I lingered for a moment, letting the soft wool rest under my palms, feeling the faint warmth as if it were a physical reminder of the task ahead of me. I knew I couldn't call the police just yet. Helen was far too clever. If I moved too soon, she would find a way to hide the truth before it ever came to light. I needed her to believe her plan had simply failed by chance, not that I had finally seen through her. Instead of driving my SUV, I called for a simple black Uber. As I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar streets of Connecticut roll by, I felt a strange, quiet stillness in my heart, a calm I hadn't felt in a very long time. I was no longer the woman who simply stood by and let things happen. I was someone finally ready to speak for my son. The law firm was housed in a towering glass building in the heart of the city, the kind of place that smells like expensive wax and old money. When I stepped into the plush waiting area, Helen was already there, perfectly positioned on a designer leather sofa. She was wearing a black Chanel dress that fit her like a second skin. She had opted for the sophisticated mourning widow look. Her makeup kept light, except for her lips, which were painted a sharp, defiant shade of red. The moment she caught sight of me through the revolving doors, the paper coffee cup in her hand gave a violent jerk. A few dark drops of espresso splashed onto her sleeve. Her eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking into tiny pinpricks of pure shock. For a fleeting second, she looked as if she were staring at a ghost. But the mask was back in place almost instantly. She smoothed her dress and stood up, gliding toward me with that practiced, graceful air. "Mother, you nearly scared me to death," Helen cried out, her voice pitched an octave higher than usual, strained with a forced cheerfulness. She reached out, intending to pull me into a hug, but I leaned away just enough to make the distance obvious. I reached up and adjusted the silk shawl on my shoulder, a cold gesture I had never used with her before. She asked why on earth I was taking an Uber, and if something had happened to my SUV, reminding me that she had told me to be so careful. I looked directly into her eyes and let a soft, gentle smile touch my lips. The kind of smile I knew would make her feel very uncomfortable. I told her the car had a minor issue with the brake system, a strange little malfunction. I mentioned how lucky it was that a kind neighbor had noticed something was wrong before I had the chance to hit the highway. I told her that there really are people looking out for us when we least expect it. Wouldn't she agree? Helen's face went rigid, and I could see the fine cracks appearing in that perfect porcelain facade. She looked away quickly, fumbling in her purse for a tissue to dab at the coffee stain, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She muttered that I really ought to have the vehicle serviced more often. We were ushered into the conference room, where our family's longtime attorney was waiting. In the past, I would have chosen a seat in the corner, wanting Helen to feel like the center of importance. But today, I walked straight to the head of the table, pulling out the heavy leather chair reserved for the head of the family. I sat down with my back perfectly straight, placing my handbag on the table with a deliberate, quiet authority. Helen looked flustered, hesitating before she sank into the chair beside me, her fingers nervously twisting her large diamond ring. "Can we get this started?" Helen asked, her tone dripping with an impatience she could no longer hide. She said she was sure Roberto would want everything handled quickly, so we could all just move on. I cut her off mid-sentence, keeping my voice low and steady. I reminded her that Roberto had worked 18 hours a day for 5 long years to build this legacy, and the least we could do was show him the respect of listening to every single word of his final wishes. I told her I realized I had been far too quick to indulge her every whim in the past, so much so that I had forgotten it was Roberto who was pouring his life force into making it all possible. Helen stared at me, her expression a mixture of annoyance and genuine bewilderment at the sudden change in my behavior. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked at both of us with a professional gravity. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, so quiet that I could hear the steady beat of my own heart. It was a sharp contrast to Helen's breathing, which had become shallow and erratic. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling aimlessly, trying to project an image of someone who was already in control. She was so certain that as the legal wife, she was about to become the sole owner of $40 million. I looked at her perfectly manicured hands, and then down at my own, which were lined with the wisdom of a long life. I thought to myself that her time of taking advantage of this family was finally coming to an end. I gave the lawyer a small nod and told him I was ready to hear exactly what my son had left behind. Mr. Thompson, and began to open the thick file on the desk. The rustle of paper in that silent room felt like thunderclaps in my ears, echoing the chaotic storm inside me. Helen sat across from me, her fingers drumming a rapid, frantic rhythm against the glass tabletop, her eyes never leaving that folder. I could feel the desperate, almost manic impatience radiating from her. She wasn't waiting for her husband's final wishes or a word of comfort. She was waiting for a check for $40 million, the prize she felt she had earned. Mr. Thompson, Helen interrupted, before he could even read the first sentence. She asked if we could just get straight to the distribution of the assets, claiming she had things to handle and that I needed to go home and rest. She said I looked unwell after my close call this morning, her voice dripping with a fake concern that felt like venom. She looked at me then, a clear, sharp threat flashing in her eyes. I stayed silent, taking a small sip of my cold tea, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. My refusal to speak was like a match thrown into a pool of gasoline. Helen stood up so abruptly her chair against the floor. Her high heels hammered against the wood like gunshots as she paced the small space. She demanded to know why I was looking at her that way, asking if you thought surviving today gave me the right to judge her. "What are you talking about, Helen?" I asked. My voice was steady, even though my heart was racing with fear. I reminded her, but I hadn't said a single word about an accident. Helen froze, her body tensing like a cornered animal. Her beautiful face twisted into something unrecognizable, distorted by pure, naked rage. She realized she had said too much, the mask finally slipping. She screamed that she was done playing nice. She called me a pathetic mother and accused me of working Roberto to death just to support the family. She claimed the $40 million was hers, the price she had to pay for putting up with my workaholic son for 5 years. She lunged forward, slamming her hands onto the table and leaning in until her face was inches from mine. The smell of her expensive perfume was so thick it made me want to gag. She told me that if the brakes didn't do their job, she would make sure I regretted ever walking into this office today. Mr. Thompson slammed his hand down on the table, telling Helen to sit down or he would call security immediately. Helen just a wild, mocking sound that chilled me to the bone. She wasn't the sweet daughter-in-law I had spent years defending and prioritizing over my own son. She dared him to call them, threatening to sue the firm for forging the will if she didn't get what she wanted. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. But then I looked at the photograph of Roberto resting next to the folder, his gentle eyes reminding me of the heart he had hidden from the world. A surge of strength traveled up my spine. I wouldn't break. Not now, not ever again. I looked Helen straight in the eye, and the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I told her that her mask was finally off, and she would never touch a single cent of Roberto's money. After that awful explosion of rage from Helen at the lawyer's office, I didn't just scurry back home to hide under the covers. Instead, I stayed behind with Mr. Thompson for another 2 hours. Sitting there in the hushed stillness of that room, surrounded by the comforting, heavy scent of old parchment and printer ink, I found myself feeling more awake and alert than I had in years. Helen had finally thrown away her mask, and now it was my job to pick up the pieces and look at them under a bright light to see the truth. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the firm support of the leather chair against my back. I began to map out every single step I needed to take to protect my home, my safety, and most importantly, the memory and dignity of my son. My very first priority was security. As soon as I stepped out of that glass building and onto the sidewalk, I called Bill. I told him I needed his help, and within an hour of me getting back home in another Uber, he was already there. He was standing in my driveway with a heavy metal toolbox and a locksmith he had known for decades. We didn't waste any time. We replaced every single lock in the entire house, from the heavy front door to the side entrance and even the automatic garage door. I also asked them to install a ring security system with cameras covering every single blind spot I had never bothered to notice before. Bill worked quietly, his movements precise and practiced. Every now and then, he would stop and look at me with the kind of quiet empathy you only get from an old, trusted friend. As he was mounting the final camera near the porch, he told me not to worry anymore. He promised that no one would be setting foot inside this house again without my explicit permission. While Bill took care of the outside, I started a thorough sweep of the inside of my home. I moved from room to room, gathering every personal item Helen had conveniently left behind during her calculated visits. I found myself in the living room, opening the small medicine cabinet tucked away in the corner, a place Helen frequented often while Roberto was still alive. My heart gave a painful tug when I found a few strange amber-colored pill bottles pushed to the very back. The labels were half torn, as if someone had tried to hide what was inside. I didn't throw them away. Instead, I carefully placed them into a small plastic zip bag, knowing I needed to get them analyzed by a professional. I stood there for a long time, thinking back to those last few weeks of Roberto's life. I remembered the way Helen insisted on cooking all his meals, those bowls of soup she would carry into his room herself, never letting me help or even touch the tray. What I used to think was devotion now felt like a cold stone sitting in the pit of my stomach. The suspicion wasn't just a vague feeling anymore. It was starting to look like a terrible, undeniable reality. Later that afternoon, a technical expert from my auto insurance company arrived to examine the SUV, a contact Mr. Thompson had arranged for me. I stood out in the garage with Bill, watching in silence as the man slid under the vehicle on a creeper. After about 10 minutes, he stood up, brushing the dust off his uniform, and showed me a clear photo he had taken of the brake lines. He looked me right in the eye and told me that the cut was clean and deliberate, made with a pair of professional-grade pliers. He explained that this wasn't just a case of old parts wearing out. Whoever did this knew exactly where to cut so that the brakes would seem fine for the first few miles of a trip, but would fail completely the moment I reached high speeds on the highway. Hearing him say those words out loud made my skin crawl. Helen didn't just want me out of the picture. She wanted me to disappear in a horrific accident that no one would ever question. But this journey back to the truth wasn't just about locks and car parts. I went back into Roberto's office and started going through the piles of bank statements Mr. Thompson had provided. I spent the entire night huddled under the warm glow of the desk lamp, comparing numbers and dates. As the hours ticked by, a devastating pattern began to emerge from the rows of figures on the pages. Helen had been secretly withdrawing massive amounts of cash from their joint accounts, just days before Roberto passed away. I found suspicious transfers to offshore accounts and stacks of bills for expensive jewelry that Roberto had never mentioned, and certainly never saw her wear. It became painfully clear that my daughter-in-law was drowning in debt from a lifestyle she couldn't afford, and my Roberto, who worked 18 hours a day until he was exhausted to the bone, was nothing more than a convenient source of cash to her. Every single number I tallied, every cut brake line, and every mysterious pill bottle I found felt like a brick I was using to build a wall around myself. I felt an incredible sense of focus, a kind of calm that I think only comes when you feel like you have already lost everything and have nothing left to fear. I was no longer that fragile, grieving mother who spent her days crying into a handkerchief. I was a woman restoring order to her family's legacy. At 11 o'clock that night, I picked up the phone and called Mr. Thompson. I told him I had the evidence of the illegal withdrawals and the expert report on the car. I told him that tomorrow morning we would start looking into Roberto's medical records. When I hung up, I looked out the window and saw the long shadows of the Connecticut streetlights stretching across the lawn. I could see the silhouette of Bill's truck, parked nearby as he kept watch. For the first time in a long time, a sense of safety started to return. Not because the danger was gone, but because I finally knew how to stand my ground. I walked over to the window and opened it just a crack, letting in the crisp, cool night air. I knew that tomorrow would be a long day, perhaps the longest and most difficult day of my entire life. But tonight, I was going to sleep deeply in a house that was finally secure. Helen thought she had backed me into a corner, but she had no idea of the strength a mother finds when she finally wakes up to the truth. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and saw a woman with eyes that were sharp, steady, and full of purpose. I whispered Roberto's name, promising him that I was doing this for him and that I would make sure everything was put back where it belonged. I reached out and turned off the lamp, leaving the house in a silence that was now being guarded with every ounce of my will. My fortress was finally ready. The following morning, the pale gold sunlight of a Connecticut autumn filtered gently through the gaps in my curtains, landing softly across my face. For For the first time in more than a decade, I didn't wake up with that heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety in my chest. I didn't find myself worrying about what mood Helen would be in, or whether Roberto was pushing himself too hard at the office. The house felt different now. It was guarded by new locks, yes, but more importantly, it was guarded by a new sense of purpose. I walked down to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking in a way that felt familiar rather than haunting. I was just about to start a strong pot of coffee when I heard a knock at the door. It was a steady, rhythmic, and warm sound, the kind of knock only Bill has. I realized then that strength doesn't just come from high-tech cameras or reinforced steel. It comes from the hands that are willing to reach out and hold yours when it feels like the rest of the world has turned its back on you. Bill was standing on the porch with a white paper bag from Dunkin' Donuts and a kind, knowing smile. He told me he thought I might need a little bit of sugar to get through what was bound to be a busy day. He let himself in and headed straight for the kitchen to help me find some plates, moving with the ease of someone who had been a part of this neighborhood for a lifetime. We sat together at my old oak table, the steam from our coffee mugs rising into the morning air. Bill looked at me, and I saw the stern, professional mask of a retired police officer soften into the look of a true friend. He told me that he had known Roberto since he was just a little boy, running around the fence in our backyard. Bill shared something that broke my heart and healed it all at once. He said Roberto had once told him that his biggest worry in life wasn't his business or his finances, but making sure that I was at peace. Roberto didn't want me to suffer a single second of pain, especially not from the people I was supposed to be able to trust the most. A single tear rolled down my cheek and landed on my half-eaten donut. Bill wasn't just here to secure my doors. He was here to secure the best parts of my son's memory. While we were talking, a small, modest sedan pulled into my driveway. A young woman stepped out, dressed simply, but carrying herself with a striking sense of intelligence and determination. Bill gave a small nod and told me that was Sarah, and that he had been the one to call her. When Sarah walked into my kitchen, she took my hands in hers with a level of respect that caught me completely off guard. She introduced herself and told me that Roberto had been the one to sponsor her entire law school scholarship after her father passed away in a construction accident years ago. She said Roberto had given her a specific instruction one day. He told her that if his mother ever needed someone to stand up for justice, he wanted her to be that person. I looked at this young woman and then back at Bill, and the realization hit me like a physical wave. During all those years when I was busy spoiling Helen and catering to her every whim, Roberto had been out in the world, quietly planting seeds of kindness. And now, in my darkest hour, those seeds had grown into a forest of protection around me. Sarah opened her laptop on the kitchen table, her fingers moving across the keys with a practiced speed. She explained that she had already reached out to Mr. Thompson and was helping him cross-reference Roberto's medical records with Helen's recent financial history. She mentioned that she had a close friend working at the hospital where Roberto was treated, and they were already finding some deeply concerning inconsistencies in his medication schedule during those final weeks. As Sarah spoke, I felt a jolt of energy move through my entire body. I wasn't just a grieving widow or a victim of a cruel daughter-in-law anymore. Sitting at that table, I had Bill, the embodiment of protection, and Sarah, the embodiment of the justice Roberto had left behind for me. We sat around that old, worn-out table, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air no longer felt heavy with mourning. It was charged with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. A warmth I hadn't felt in years spread from my heart all the way to my fingertips. I looked up at Roberto's portrait on the wall and silently promised him that his sacrifice would not be in vain. I felt stronger than I ever had before, not because of the millions of dollars in a bank account, but because I had found my real family. These were the people who loved Roberto for the man he was, not for the wealth he possessed, I stood up and cleared the crumbs from the table with a firm, decisive motion. I told them, my voice didn't shake anymore, and asked them to tell me exactly what we needed to do next. Helen thought she could isolate me and leave me with nothing, but she had made a terrible mistake. She had no idea who she was truly dealing with. Martha found wonderful allies through the kindness her son had sown. Have you ever received unexpected help from a stranger during the most difficult times of your life? Sometimes it is those who are not related by blood who are our most sincere protectors. Please leave a comment sharing your story about your guardian angel so we can spread warmth together. Roberto's office, the place where I finally found some comfort last night, has been transformed into a small, cold investigation room. The blue light from Sarah's laptop screen casts long, flickering shadows across the walls, making everything feel sterile and urgent. I sat there, my fingers wrapped so tightly around a mug of lukewarm tea that my knuckles turned white, watching Bill carefully place the pill bottles I found in Helen's cabinet into individual plastic evidence bags. Bill looked at me, his voice dropping into a that reminded me of his years on the force. He told me that we weren't just looking for answers anymore. We were looking for the justice that Roberto had been stripped of. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, knowing that by the time the sun came up, my life would never be the same again. Sarah began navigating through Roberto's MyChart portal, the digital trail of his final days. Rows of medical data started scrolling past like a complex maze. She pointed to a chart showing Roberto's heart rate and blood work from his last 3 weeks. Back then, the doctors thought he was just suffering from extreme exhaustion and a mysterious virus. But Sarah showed me the spikes in his potassium levels and liver enzymes, noting how they jumped unnaturally right after he received what Helen called special care at home. I closed my eyes and remembered the bowls of asparagus soup Helen insisted on making and the detox juices she forced Roberto to drink every morning. At the time, I praised her for being such a devoted wife. I had no idea that every spoonful of that soup was a step bringing my son closer to the cemetery. The sound of Sarah's typing grew faster, more urgent. She pulled up pharmacy records from our local CVS. She found exactly what she was looking for. It turned out, Helen had used a distant relative's prescription to buy a high-dose sedative and a specific cardiac medication that causes extreme lethargy if misused. Sarah explained that Helen didn't want Roberto to pass away instantly. She wanted him weak, his mind clouded and muddled, so he wouldn't realize what she was doing to his bank accounts. A wave of pure disgust rose in my throat. This girl, the one I had hugged and told Roberto to be patient with, had meticulously planned to torture his body day by day. She wasn't human. She was a predator, driven by a greed that had no bottom. Sarah continued, her voice hardening as she opened a set of secret credit card statements that Mr. Thompson had just emailed over. The amount of debt on the screen made my head spin. Over $2 million lost at casinos in Atlantic City, along with high-interest loans from shadowy private lenders. Helen wasn't just a big spender. She was a desperate gambler, hiding behind the mask of a grieving widow. She needed Roberto gone, and she needed it to happen quickly so she could collect on his $5 million life insurance policy and take control of the $40 million trust. Every signature Roberto had scrawled on those power of attorney documents while he was delirious from the medication was a nail in his coffin. Bill suddenly called out from under Roberto's desk, shining his flashlight at the underside of the mahogany wood. He pulled out a tiny black device that had been hidden with professional precision. It was a nanny cam. It seemed Roberto had started to suspect something was wrong before he became too weak to act. With trembling hands, we connected the device to the computer. A video from a week before Roberto died appeared on the screen. In the clip, Helen was standing in the corner of this very room. She wasn't crying or mourning like the performance she put on for me. She was frantically digging through Roberto's drawers because she couldn't find the code to his safe. Then, with a chilling calmness, she took a bottle from her purse and poured a large amount of white powder into Roberto's water glass. Her eyes were cold and empty, as if she were just making a casual drink instead of mixing a lethal dose of poison. I had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. The image of my son, thin and pale, reaching out with shaking hands to drink that water, while Helen watched with a faint, hollow smile. It was more haunting than any horror movie. I heard Roberto's voice on the recording, a faint, ragged whisper that tore my heart to pieces. He told her he felt so tired. Helen's response was ice cold. She just told him to go to sleep, and that he would feel better once he did. The truth was so raw and so brutal, but the room felt like it was spinning. I realized then that my own bias and favoritism had nurtured a killer right inside our home. I had pressured my own son to stay with the very person who was quietly stealing his life. Sarah turned off the video, and a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had held Helen's, that had stroked her hair and told her she was safe because I would protect her. In that moment, those hands felt stained. But the pain was starting to transform into something sharper. Clarity. Every illusion of a happy family had been shattered. I stood up, and for the first time, my legs didn't feel like they were going to give way. I thanked Bill and Sarah, my gaze fixed on the screen where Helen's face was frozen in a single frame. She thought Roberto had taken this secret to his grave, but she had no idea that Roberto had left the truth for his mother. And that truth was going to be the thing that finally put her in handcuffs. We spent the rest of the night printing and backing up every single piece of evidence. Each page that slid out of the printer was another proof of an unforgivable crime. I felt a strange, quiet peace beginning to settle into my soul. No matter how much the truth hurts, it is always better than living in a beautiful lie. I wasn't going to stop at just protecting the money. I was going to make sure Helen paid for every drop of sweat, every ounce of pain, and every final breath Roberto had to take. "The game is over, Helen," I whispered to the empty office as the first light of dawn began to break over Connecticut. It was a promise to my son that everything was about to change. Bill and Sarah finally left, leaving me alone in the stillness of Roberto's office as the clock on the wall struck 3 a.m. The silence didn't feel heavy or frightening anymore. Instead, it wrapped around me like an old, well-worn blanket, offering a strange kind of comfort. I reached over and turned off the cold, blue glow of the computer screens, leaving only the soft, amber light from the desk lamp Roberto used every single night. In that dim glow, I watched the tiny dust motes dancing in the air, and it hit me with a sudden, quiet clarity that I was finally standing in my son's true world. It was a world built on silent devotion and a series of hidden heartaches that I had been too blind or too busy to notice for far too long. I walked over to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along a dusty wooden model of a sailboat. Roberto had carved it himself when he was only 10 years old. I remembered how I had scolded him back then, telling him not to make a mess on the rug and urging him to go outside and play with the other boys. He had just looked up at me and smiled, his small hands covered in sawdust, quietly hiding a nick on his finger from the carving knife. Touching the smooth, aged wood now, I felt the incredible patience he must have possessed even then. Roberto was always like that. He had spent his entire life quietly absorbing the cuts and bruises of the world, from a greedy wife and a mother who played favorites, all just to maintain a sense of peace for the people he loved. My son wasn't just some distant tech millionaire. He was still that same 10-year-old boy, always trying to do the right thing, even when his own heart was breaking. I picked up his navy blue sweater from the back of the chair and pressed it against my face. The scent of Roberto, a mix of sandalwood, black coffee, and that specific warm smell that belonged only to him, was still there, lingering in the fibers. In that moment, I felt as though he were actually in the room, wrapping his arms around me in a quiet embrace. A profound sense of peace began to settle into the hollow spaces of my soul. I didn't feel like a betrayed 68-year-old woman anymore. I felt like a mother, the only person Roberto truly trusted to carry his legacy forward. My tears fell softly onto the soft wool, but they weren't tears of agony. They were tears of connection. I knew that even though he was gone, his spirit was still here, guiding me through the darkness of this night. I looked out the window at the Connecticut garden, which was now bathed in a brilliant silver moonlight. Roberto always loved nights like this. I whispered into the quiet air, telling him that I finally saw everything. I saw the kindness he showed to Sarah, the quiet strength he maintained despite the poison in his veins, and the way he had managed to protect me, even when he was facing the end of his own life. I realized I didn't need to carry the weight of my past mistakes anymore. This awakening, this painful but beautiful truth, was the final gift he had given me. Peace, I realized, isn't the absence of a fight. It's knowing exactly who and what you are fighting for. I folded the sweater neatly and placed it back on his chair as if he were just stepping out for a moment. A new kind of strength, something pure and unshakable, began to flow through me. The sun would be rising soon, and with it would come the final legal battle with Helen. But the fear was completely gone. I had Roberto's blessing. I had the truth as my shield, and I had a mother's love as my weapon. I stepped out of the office and gently pulled the door shut behind me, feeling lighter than I had in years. I whispered for him to sleep well, and promised that when the morning came, I would finally get him the justice he deserved. The sky over Connecticut was a flat, oppressive gray this morning. Cold, needles of drizzle drummed against the car windows as Bill drove Sarah and me back to Mr. Thompson's law office. Inside my handbag, my fingers kept grazing the small, cool surface of a USB drive. That tiny piece of plastic held the weight of a dozen crimes, everything from the jagged cuts on my brake lines to the slow poison that had clouded my son's final days. I hadn't slept a wink, but for once, it wasn't because of the fear. It was a cold, sharp focus I hadn't felt in years. I knew Helen wouldn't just sit there and wait for the end. People like her, when they feel the walls closing in, they don't just give up. They try to set the whole forest on fire just to find a way out. I took a deep breath, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the truth sitting right there in my lap. When we stepped into the conference room, the air felt thick enough to choke on. Helen was already there, but she wasn't alone. Sitting next to her was a man in a sharp gray suit with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Lawyer Sterling. In the legal world around here, they call him the hyena. He specializes in the kind of dirty inheritance battles that leave everyone involved feeling like they need a long shower. Helen had traded her frantic look from yesterday for a polished navy blue suit. Her hair was pulled back into a perfect tight bun. She looked every bit the successful, grieving businesswoman, just trying to hold it all together. As I took my seat, Sterling didn't even wait for Mr. Thompson to open his mouth. He slid a heavy, thick folder across the mahogany table toward us. He said that before we moved an inch further with the will, there was a grave concern regarding my legal capacity that had to be addressed. He looked at me with a look of fake pity that made my skin crawl. He claimed they had evidence showing I had been displaying signs of severe cognitive decline, dementia, over the last 6 months. He said Helen had been meticulously documenting every time I forgot my keys, every time I supposedly talked to myself, and even instances where I had supposedly hallucinated about someone trying to kill me. Helen touched a handkerchief to her eyes, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. She looked at me and said she was so sorry, but she couldn't stand by and watch me destroy myself. She told the room that all my talk about cut breaks and poisoned soup was just the product of my anxiety and late-stage dementia. She said her only wish was to move me into a specialized memory care facility where I would finally be protected. The blood in my veins felt like it was starting to boil. I repeated the word dementia back to them, my voice sounding low and gravelly with a rage I could barely contain. I asked her if that was really her plan, to lock me away in some institution so she could spend my son's hard-earned money without anyone looking over her shoulder. Sterling cut me off with a voice as cold as a winter morning. He told me that my agitation was a textbook symptom of my condition. He explained they had already prepared a petition for the court to appoint Helen as my legal guardian, giving her full control over me and everything Roberto had left behind. He told us that until an independent medical evaluation was completed, every accusation I made against his client was legally worthless. I looked over at Mr. Thompson and saw him frowning, his eyes full of a deep professional worry. It was a calculated, vicious move. If they won, I would lose my voice, and every piece of evidence I had would be dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old woman. A wave of helplessness started to wash over me, black and cold, threatening to pull me under. I looked at Helen and saw the tiniest, most triumphant smile hiding behind her handkerchief. She really thought my age was a weakness she could exploit. She thought she could use the legal system to simply erase me. But right then, I felt Sarah's hand rest gently on my shoulder. That small, firm touch was like a jolt of electricity, reminding me of Roberto. He hadn't chosen Sarah just because she was a brilliant lawyer. He chose her because she knew how to fight for what was right. I took a long, deep breath and let the stillness return to me. I asked them if they really wanted to base their entire case on my mental capacity. I reached into my bag, pulled out the USB drive, and set it down on the glass tabletop. The small click it made sounded like a gunshot in that silent room. I told them that if I were truly as confused as they claimed, I wondered how I had managed to gather high-definition video of Helen stirring white powder into my son's water. I asked them if a woman with dementia would have the presence of mind to coordinate with a forensic insurance expert to document the professional tool marks on her own cut-break lines. I saw Sterling's face pale just a fraction, and Helen went completely rigid. I told Sterling he might want to review the files on that drive very carefully before he tried to commit me to a home. I warned him that if I went to court, I wouldn't be going alone. I would be bringing evidence of first-degree murder with me. The entire atmosphere in that room flipped in a heartbeat. Sterling reached for the drive, his hands shaking just enough for me to notice. Helen started to breathe in short, panicked gasps, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for a window to jump out of. I sat there with my back straight, feeling the iron-willed resilience of my son flowing through me. They had underestimated me. They thought an old mother would be an easy target, someone they could bully with big words and cruel lies. But they forgot that there is nothing more alert or more dangerous than a mother seeking justice for her child. I looked at Helen, my voice as cold as the rain outside. I told her we wouldn't be needing that memory care center. I told her the only thing she needed to prepare right now was a very good criminal defense attorney. Martha almost became a victim of this vile attack. What do you think of Helen's heartlessness in using her mother-in-law's health as a tool for profit? Have you ever witnessed someone being falsely accused of being mentally incapacitated, just so others could easily control them? Please leave your opinions below so we can all speak up to protect justice for the elderly. I returned home after that grueling meeting as the city lights began to flicker on through the mist. The raindrops clinging to the windows of the Uber looked like blurred tears against the glass. But my heart felt as dry and solid as a stone pulled from the garden. Stepping into the house, which was now guarded and secure, I didn't feel that old familiar shiver of fear in the shadows anymore. I knew Helen was out there somewhere, likely spiraling in a panic now that her final mask had been stripped away. I set my handbag down on the kitchen table and stared at the thick stack of files Sarah had prepared for me. Tonight was the final night of waiting. Tomorrow, every hidden thing would have to stand in the unforgiving light of justice. I spent the evening sitting in the quiet of the office with Sarah and Mr. Thompson on a secured conference call. We went over every single timestamp, every pharmacy record, and every suspicious bank transfer one last time. Sarah had done something truly remarkable by connecting with an independent forensic pathologist who was ready to testify that the levels in Roberto's blood work were impossible to explain through natural illness. Mr. Thompson kept reminding me to stay calm when we finally stood before the judge. He told me they would try to rattle me again, but he said I had to remember that the truth was on our side. I just nodded, my hands wrapped tightly around a mug of hot chamomile tea. I realized then, but the truth doesn't need to shout or scream to be heard. It only needs to be presented clearly, in a way that simply cannot be denied. It was nearly midnight when my phone started vibrating against the wood of the nightstand. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was before I even picked it up. I hesitated for a long second before I finally pressed the button and put the phone to my ear. Immediately, I heard Helen's voice, thick with that sobbing, breathless sound that used to make my heart melt with pity. She begged me not to do this, telling me she was sorry and that she had only made those choices because she was backed into a corner by her debts. She asked me if I really thought Roberto would want to see his own wife sitting in a prison cell. Her voice was shaking, and she sounded so full of regret, but all I could hear was the cold calculation behind every sob. She wasn't crying because she had hurt Roberto. She was crying because she was terrified of losing her freedom and the luxury she had killed for. I sat there in the dark and listened, feeling a ghost of that old pain flare up and then finally die out for good. I told her as calmly as I could that she wasn't asking me for forgiveness. She was asking me for a way to escape the consequences of sins she had no intention of fixing. I reminded her that Roberto had loved her with every ounce of his being, and she had repaid that love with bowls of soup laced with poison. I told her she had tried to take the life of the person who treated her like his own flesh and blood. The crying on the other end stopped instantly, replaced by a silence that was far more chilling than the tears. Her voice turned sharp and cold as she warned me that she was still Roberto's legal wife and that she would fight me until there was nothing left. I told her that I would be doing the same, and then I simply hung up the phone. I blocked the number immediately, feeling a wave of pure relief wash over me the moment the screen went dark. In the past, I was always so afraid of conflict, always trying to smooth things over just to keep up the appearance of a happy family. But standing there in my quiet bedroom, I finally understood that some things simply cannot be reconciled. Betrayal and cruelty like hers require a reckoning. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark driveway. I could see Bill sitting in his truck across the street, his headlights flashing once in a quiet, steady greeting. I wasn't alone. I had real friends standing with me, and I had the memory of my son tucked safely in my heart. I went to the closet and pulled out the elegant gray suit I had chosen for tomorrow. I ran my hand over the fine wool, feeling the weight of the moment I was about to step into. I wasn't dreaming about winning or losing anymore. I was just dreaming about a night of sleep where I didn't have to jump at every sound or worry about my son's honor being dragged through the mud. I let myself remember Roberto one last time tonight, not as a busy millionaire, but as the little boy who used to hold my hand as we walked through the biting Connecticut winters. I whispered to the shadows that I was going to do this for him, and I felt a hard, unbreakable resolve take root in my chest. Before I finally climbed into bed, I opened my small leather journal and wrote down a few short lines. They weren't accusations or angry words. They were just the lessons I had learned about my own blindness and the danger of playing favorites. I knew I had to face my own mistakes before I could ask anyone else to face their crimes. The house was incredibly quiet, but it was the silence of preparation, not of loneliness. I closed my eyes and let my breathing slow down to a steady rhythm. When the first light of the sun hit the trees tomorrow morning, I wouldn't be walking into that courtroom as a victim. I would be walking in as the person who was finally bringing the truth home. That morning, I woke up long before the alarm had a chance to sound, my eyes opening to the first soft light of a new day. I stood in front of the vanity mirror for a long time, looking at the woman staring back at me. She wasn't the withered, grief-stricken mother I had been just a few weeks ago. There was a clarity in her eyes and a steadiness in her hands that I thought I had lost forever. I carefully put on the charcoal gray suit I had prepared the night before, smoothing out the fabric over my shoulders. As a final touch, I pinned a small silver sailboat to my lapel, a tiny replica of the one Roberto had carved as a boy. It was my anchor today. Bill and Sarah were already waiting at the front door, their faces set with a quiet, unshakable determination. We didn't need many words as we walked to the car. We were like a small, tight-knit team, moving toward the moment we had worked so hard to reach. When we stepped into Mr. Thompson's law office, the air felt different, chilled, but remarkably clear. This wasn't a place for negotiation or pleading anymore. This was the place where the truth would finally take its seat. Helen was already there, perched on the edge of her chair next to Sterling. She was trying her best to maintain her usual polished exterior, but I could see the cracks. Her fingers were laced so tightly together that her knuckles were turning a ghostly white, and her eyes kept darting toward the thick leather folder on Mr. Thompson's desk. She was terrified, and she had every reason to be. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the large wood-paneled room. He looked at each of us in turn before beginning. He stated that we were gathered to hear the official and final last will and testament of Roberto Miller, a document that had been drafted and signed in his presence just 48 hours before Roberto's sudden passing. I saw Helen lean forward, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged. Sterling watched me with a calculating, narrow-eyed gaze, likely still believing that his disgusting attempt to label me as mentally unfit would hold some kind of weight. Mr. Thompson began to read Roberto's words, and it felt as though my son was standing right there in the room with us. Roberto spoke of his deep gratitude for me, his mother, and shared a heartbreaking regret for the times he had allowed me to feel sidelined in our own family. He said he wanted to make sure I never felt that way again. Then came the words that changed everything. Roberto stated that he was leaving his entire estate, valued at over $40 million, including all properties, stock portfolios, and trust funds, to the only person he had ever trusted completely, his mother, Martha Miller. The silence that followed was broken by a violent crash. Helen had slammed her palms onto the table and stood up so fast her chair went flying backward. She screamed that it was impossible and that none of it could be true. She shrieked about being the legal wife, her face twisting into something unrecognizable, a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. The woman standing there was no longer the sophisticated daughter-in-law I had spent years trying to please. She looked hollow, her voice cracking as she accused us all of conspiring against her to steal what she felt was hers. She even lunged toward Mr. Thompson, her hand reaching out to grab the document. But Bill was already there, stepping in front of her with the quiet authority of a man who had seen it all. Sterling looked flustered, his arrogant smirk long gone, as he realized Roberto had outmaneuvered him with total finality. I just sat there, watching her spiral. Seeing her like this, so desperate and so exposed, I didn't feel an ounce of pity. All I felt was a deep, cold disgust for the way she had treated my son. I told her, as quietly and firmly as I could, that the will was very real. I told her that Roberto had known everything. He had known about the secret gambling debts, and he had known exactly what she was putting into his water every single morning. Helen went dead still, her eyes going wide as the color drained from her face. She tried to stutter out a denial, asking what on earth I was talking about and calling my words the ramblings of a confused woman. Mr. Thompson gave a small, somber nod to Sarah. She opened her laptop and turned the screen around so both Helen and Sterling could see it. The video began to play. In the heavy silence of the room, we watched Helen standing in the corner of Roberto's office, her eyes cold as she stirred that white powder into his glass. Then we heard Roberto's voice, that faint, heartbreaking whisper, telling her he felt so tired. We heard her icy response, telling him to just go to sleep. Helen started backing away from the table, her hips hitting her chair as she shook her head, whispering over and over that it wasn't her and that the footage had to be fake. Sarah didn't flinch. She stated that the video had already been verified by digital forensics. She added that we had the chemical analysis of the medication found in Helen's personal cabinet and the toxicology reports showing those exact substances in Roberto's system. Right then, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. 2 uniformed police officers and a plainclothes investigator stepped inside, their footsteps heavy on the carpet. They walked straight toward Helen. The lead officer informed her that she was being placed under arrest for the first-degree murder of Roberto Miller and the attempted murder of Martha Miller. The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place was a cold, mechanical sound that seemed to signal the absolute end of the lie. Helen collapsed to her knees, sobbing now, but there was no sorrow in her voice, only the frantic, high-pitched terror of someone who had lost everything. Sterling was already scrambling to pack his briefcase, looking for any way to slip out of the room before he could be linked to her any further. As the officers began to lead Helen away, they had to walk her right past my chair. She looked at me one last time, her eyes a chaotic mix of hatred and desperate pleading. I stood up and looked her straight in the eye. I told her she could have had a beautiful life. She had Roberto's love, and she had my protection. But her greed had turned her into something monstrous. I told her that now, the justice Roberto deserved would finally be served. Once the door closed behind them, it felt as if 1,000 pounds had been lifted from my shoulders. I sank back into my chair and let the tears come. They weren't tears of pain this time. They were tears of pure, overwhelming relief. Mr. Thompson walked over and placed a kind hand on my shoulder. He told me it was finally over and that everything was legally protected in my name. He promised that she would never be able to hurt me or touch this family ever again. I looked over at Sarah and Bill, the 2 people who had stood by me when I was at my lowest. I realized in that moment that I wasn't wealthy because of the $40 million Roberto had left me. I was wealthy because I had found the truth, and I had found friends who actually cared about my soul. I picked up Roberto's will and held it against my heart, feeling as if I were holding him one last time. I thanked them all and told them that I finally knew exactly what I needed to do to honor my son's life. We walked out of the office together and into the brilliant Connecticut sunshine. The storm from the day before had passed, leaving the air smelling fresh and clean. I took a deep, full breath, feeling the life surging back into my own body. I knew then that I wouldn't be spending this money on the designer bags or the luxury trips Helen had craved. I decided right there that I would use Roberto's legacy to build a foundation for orphans, just as he had always wanted, and a center to protect other seniors from the kind of abuse I had nearly disappeared into. Roberto's kindness wouldn't die with him. It would grow into something that would help thousands of people. Bill drove me back to the house, and as we pulled up to the gate, I noticed the roses in the front garden were starting to bloom again after the rain. The house didn't feel like a cold fortress anymore. It felt like a home, warm and full of hope. I invited Bill and Sarah in for tea, and we sat around that old oak table in the kitchen. We talked and laughed softly, making plans for the foundation and the future. The justice had been served, the truth had won, and most importantly, I had found myself again. I was no longer the mother who lived in the shadow of favoritism and blind trust. I was Martha Miller, and I was going to spend the rest of my days living a life that was worthy of the incredible love my son had shown me. My journey had been long and painful, but as I looked at the smiling faces of my friends, I knew I was finally home. 1 year has passed since that fateful day at the lawyer's office, and my world has found a new rhythm, a rhythm that is slower, more sincere, and filled with a light I once thought I would never see again. Helen is currently serving 20 years in a state prison for the path she chose. But I try not to let my mind linger on the darkness of her cell anymore. Instead, I sit on my wooden porch in Connecticut, watching the roses Roberto loved so much blooming under the warm afternoon sun. This house is no longer a place of hidden secrets, or where fear hangs like a heavy mist. It has become a home where laughter is finally allowed to grow. This evening, I'm preparing a simple dinner of lemon-roasted chicken and a traditional American apple pie cooling on the counter. Bill is outside helping me trim the hedges, telling old stories from his days on the police force that always end in a hearty laugh. Sarah, the young girl Roberto once sponsored, has just arrived. She is now a full-time lawyer for the Roberto Miller Legacy Foundation, carrying Roberto's spirit into her work every day. Looking at them, I realize a simple but profound truth. Family is not just about the blood in your veins. Real family includes the people who stand beside you when the storm hits, those who love you for exactly who you are, not for what you possess. Every month, I visit the children's center that Roberto's foundation sponsors. When I see those kids getting a chance at an education, I see my son's smile in their bright eyes. I spent years being biased and blindly nurturing a person who only meant to do harm. But this late awakening has given me the chance to live a life that actually matters. I am no longer wealthy because of $40 million. I am wealthy because every night I can lay my head down and know I finally did right by my son. Living with fairness is the best medicine for a broken soul. This is Casey. Listening to Martha's story, I am struck by the coldness of greed, but also moved by the power of her awakening. We often protect the people we perceive as fragile in our families, but in doing so, we can create a terrible injustice for the ones who are quietly sacrificing, like Roberto. The biggest lesson is that true love should never be blind. Favoritism is a poison that creates cracks in the hearts of those we love most. But from the ashes of betrayal, Martha built a chosen family where kindness and justice are the strongest bonds. Don't wait until you lose someone to start appreciating their quiet efforts. What do you think about this story? What is the biggest lesson you take away from Martha's journey? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next stories.